Hi everybody, welcome to our lecture on measurement. I get really excited about measurement because I think it's one of the most neglected areas in research design, and it really can't be the most neglected because that causes some significant issues with the results of studies and your ability to interpret those studies as well. Hi everyone. I promised you that this week I would include a little bit of information on writing an active rather than passive voice because I had started giving each of you feedback in our little scaffolding sessions where I try to help you work through issues with your paper, and I thought it might be more helpful to kind of lecture on it and then also offer you a link to a YouTube video that explains it a lot better. So when we write in active voice, the subject of our sentence performs some sort of action, okay? However, when we write in passive voice, some sort of action is happening to the subject in our sentence. So if I was going to give you all an example of this, I could say that the legislation was passed by the legislators. If we're looking at that sentence, if we were to write that sentence out, we would notice that passed is our action word, and our subject of the sentence was the legislators, and that we're seeing that action word before we have our subject. However, if I wanted to change that sentence into active voice rather than passive voice, what I would say is that is the following: the legislators passed the legislation. So what you notice there is that we moved the word legislators to the beginning of the sentence and then use an active verb rather than a passive verb as our action word. And so in that, you'll notice when we wrote in passive voice, when we said the legislation was passed by the legislators, you'll notice that we inserted one of those to be verbs into the sentence. If you don't remember from the little scaffolding sessions that we have, to be verbs are am, is, are, was, were, be, been, being, has, have, had, do, does, did, should, could, would, may, might, must, shall, can, and will. So there's 23 of these. Sometimes you'll hear them called the to be verbs, or you'll also hear them the 23 verbs of being. So I actually have a YouTube video that you can watch. I will put that link into our Blackboard site that will be with this lecture. So if you want to pause this lecture now and then go click on that YouTube video, you can watch that, or you can watch this entire lecture and then watch that YouTube video after you're done watching this lecture. I think this is one of the biggest things that people get when they're going through a research methods course. Not only is it preferable in all of your writing, but APA actually says that you have to write in active rather than passive voice. This is also one of those APA rules that people probably break frequently, and it makes it difficult to enforce such a rule, but it's something that you really need to work on because it makes you an incredibly better writer. Remember, the guideline that I gave for all of you was to try to only use 2 to 3 to be verbs per page of your writing, and we will continue work on that throughout the rest of this project. So our unit learning objectives for this unit include the following. I want you to be able to identify and explain the psychometric properties of a measure. I want you to be able to define and provide accurate examples of reliability and validity. I want you to be able to distinguish among the different types of reliability. I want you to be able to distinguish among different types of validity. I want you to be able to explain and examine the sensitivity of a measure. And then, most importantly, I want you to be able to use information that you learn about measurement in order to critically design or evaluate a research study. All right, so let's go ahead and get into measurement then. In order to introduce measurement, we first have to speak about data. So the way that I like to define data is that data is information. Now, if I were to ask you, what is quantitative data, what would you tell me? Go ahead and answer out loud, and I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it and formulate your answer. And I really want you to physically just say it out loud, even though I'm not in the room with you. If you said that quantitative data is information represented by numbers, I agree with you full-heartedly. So then if we're talking about measurement, measurement is the process of turning information into numbers. I know that my definition of measurement and the definition I'm about to give you for measure may differ from our readings, and that's okay. But I think this is the one that I agree with most for when I'm talking about research and things like that. You're always going to have experts kind of disagree on different operational definitions and things with it. That's fine. What you'll do is take this information and assimilate it into your knowledge base for when you're critically thinking about designing, whether it's this manuscript proposal project that you're working on for me, or if it's designing a study on your own in the future. So a measure then, our measures are the tools that we use to turn information into numbers. So for example, if you were wanting to learn or you want to quantify how much depression someone has, what would you do? If you said you would give the person some sort of inventory that tried to measure their level of depression, that's 100% right. So the measure in that example would be the actual questions that the person is answering so that you can kind of gauge what their level of depression is. So a really common measure used to assess levels of depression would be the Beck Depression Inventory. Another one would be the PHQ, which I think stands for Patient Health Questionnaire. And so we use these tools or these measures to convert somebody's experiences into a number so that we can deal with it in statistics and try to find answers to whatever research questions that we have. So sensitivity, each measure that we have has a level of sensitivity to it. So Kasdan in 2016, his definition of it was measurement sensitivity refers to the capacity of a measure to reflect systematic variation, change, or differences in response to an experimental manipulation, intervention, or different group comparison. So if you're going to put this into your own words, what would you say? If you said something like measurement sensitivity allows kind of for some sort of range of responses that reflect changes or differences from participants, that would be one way to answer that question. Really, sensitivity, what it deals with is being able to tell that there's differences between participants, because if you don't have a sensitivity where your measure can gauge accurately how people vary from one another, you're not going to be able to conduct accurate research, right? So for example, I once used a measure for one of my studies and it didn't have great sensitivity, and everybody answered, I think the options were like 1 through 5, and everybody answered 1. Well, that didn't help me much because there may be variation in my participants in that study, but because my measure was not sensitive enough, I wasn't able to detect those differences, and then it caused issues in the study that I was doing. So it's really important as we go and evaluate measures for inclusion in this project, and hopefully ultimately this project leads to your thesis, it's really important to make sure that your measures have appropriate levels of sensitivity. We also have floor and ceiling effects, which kind of relate to some issues that we see with measures. Floor effects are when most of your participants have very low scores. This means that the floor was set too high of a measure. So the example that I gave earlier, when most of the participants in my study marked the 1 option, it was because they didn't have any other options that were less than that, whatever that 1 meant. And so everyone was gathering around the bottom of the measure. Ceiling effects then are when most of your participants have very high scores. This is also a problem with measures because you're still not able to see that variation in your sample. And so you want to make sure that when you're designing your study that when you're looking at the measures, that the measures won't have some sort of floor or ceiling effect when we get the scores from your measures. There's also something else that we had to deal with in measurement, are something called response sets. For example, acquiescence is the tendency for individuals to respond affirmatory, which means true or yes, to a questionnaire item. So this would be that they are going to prefer to respond yes or true to questionnaire items, and this could be for a number of reasons. If it's some sort of survey for somebody for their job, they may not want to get somebody in trouble, so they're going to really try to say true or yes if those are high quality responses. Another type of response set is naysaying. This would be a tendency for individuals to disagree and deny characteristics. So this is the complete opposite of acquiescence. So we have to pay attention to this when we're working through our measures and kind of to determine what we're going to use for our study. A third one is socially desirable responding. This is a tendency to respond to items in such a way to place oneself in a positive or socially desirable light. So we've kind of talked about this earlier in this class. An example that I gave before was about the BASC. So the BASC is a social and emotional measure that clinical and school psychologists use to kind of look at some problem behaviors that a child might have. This measure has a parent report, it has teacher report, but it also has self-report. And so on the self-report of the BASC, what they have is this index that tries to see if somebody is answering the questions in a socially desirable way. They call it the faking good index. And so they have questions that are outrageous where people typically really shouldn't always be marking affirmative for them, that paint them in a really good light. And if they do kind of have these elevated, then we know that that the person is probably trying to make themselves look better than it's supposed to. Okay, and so that's kind of a problem, right? And if we think back to our experimental validity and the threats to our different types of experimental validity, this can cause some significant issues with which one of those. If you said that it would cause probably some significant issues with the internal experimental validity or the internal research validity, as I've been calling it in class, you're absolutely correct. But not only that, I mean, if you look at the other types of experimental validity, I mean, you're going to have issues with trying to generalize it to other populations. You're going to have trouble saying that you have statistical conclusion validity as well. So it's really important to kind of look at these different things that we're looking as issues with measurement, and then recognizing that they can actually also be threats to the experimental validity of your study as well. Another type of response set is called the end aversion bias, and this is a tendency to avoid extreme scores on an item that's a 1 through 7 scale, even if those extreme scores accurately reflect the characteristic. So when we're talking about end aversion bias, a lot of times we'll see this with Likert scales, where people don't want to hit 1 where it says none of the time, and they don't want to say 7, that's all the time, even if that accurately represents their experience. Not all people do this, but some people will have these different types of response sets. Just like if you're going through some sort of experience and you don't want to say it was the best thing that ever happened in your life, you may mark a 6 instead of a 7 because you're just really uncomfortable kind of hitting that mark, even if it really did reflect your experience. So psychometrics, it's a fancy word. If you kind of break it down though, psycho is representing psychology or psychological based tests. Metrics are kind of thinking about numbers and the quality of these measures. So when we talk about psychometrics, we're talking about two specific things. We're first speaking about validity. And so if you remember validity, the validity of your measure says, like if you have a valid measure, it's saying that your measure is measuring what you intended it to. It's doing its job, as I like to say. Students often get validity and reliability really confused, so this is one of the things that you're just going to have to memorize, that when we're saying, is it valid? Is this representative of what it's supposed to be? It's really important that our measures have validity, and we'll talk about the different ways that you can establish validity on some upcoming of these slides. Now, reliability then is your measure consistent? We talked about this earlier in class, but when we were talking about data evaluation and the statistical conclusion validity, experimental validity, it's really important to have reliability of your measures, because if your measures are not reliable, then your results of your study are also not reliable. Something that's really important, though, is that we're really paying attention to those psychometric properties of our measures, because this is the part that people sometimes don't pay as much detail to, and it's actually one of the most important things you can do for the field of research, for your personal studies, for your thesis, for a dissertation if you get there. So this quote's a really great one. It is critical to bear in mind, because measures are often selected without sufficient attention to the extent to which they measure the construct or facet of the construct. And that's really dangerous. If we are using measures that actually don't represent the construct that we're interested in studying, then the results that we're getting from our studies are not going to be accurate, and then that's unfortunate, because there is a large portion of the population of the world that does not understand research and this process, and some people use your research or someone else's research as a weapon, or they might use it to inform policy. But if your research is not accurate, then we're making policy decisions on faulty information, and that can actually hurt people. So although sometimes you'll see professors say that people can develop their own measures for research, I am in the camp that you never develop your own measures for research unless you are doing a measure development study. And hopefully from the readings that we did this week, I thought they were really great readings, especially the longer one. Hopefully that was something that was really ingrained in your mind. I know that the reading that we did for this week didn't necessarily talk about like self-surveys as much as they did with some of the measurement that's used more in cognitive psych, but I think a lot of the things that they were saying within our reading really do apply to any type of measure. And we'll keep continuing this conversation as we move through this lecture, as we move into the different types of reliability and the different types of validity. Okay, so psychometric properties. Again, what are psychometric properties? These are the validity and reliability information for your measure. In your reading, you learned about a couple different types and different ways that you can do the reliability, especially the internal consistency or the split half reliability, which we'll talk about. And so reliability, again, this means consistency. I'm going to repeat this over and over again because this is one of the most confused things in research methods. Students get confused about reliability and validity, so it's one of those things that you're just going to have to memorize. So it's consistency. There are several different types of reliability that you'll learn about. One is the test-retest reliability, and this is the consistency of a test over time. So in the reading that we had, it talked about test-retest reliability, but I think one thing that's really important, that if you're trying to establish test-retest reliability of a measure, that you cannot have some sort of intervention that's in between the first time that you give the measure and the second time. So for example, if I wanted to test the test-retest reliability of a anxiety measure, I would not want to give the anxiety measure the first time and then give an anxiety intervention for a month and then use the anxiety measure again and then correlate those two, because you have that intervention. You hope that they'll improve in their anxiety as a result of that intervention. So whenever you're doing a measurement development study, or if you're using a measure that hasn't been used before and you're wanting to establish test-retest reliability, you're likely going to want to give the measure and then wait however long and then give the measure again, but not have an intervention that's in between. And so to demonstrate your test-retest reliability, you're just going to use, typically unless you're running into issues like we saw in our article, or you have your data or your measures on an ordinal or nominal level measurement. For test-retest reliability, you're basically just going to do a Pearson product moment correlation and see how strong the correlation is between the first time that you give the measure and the second time that you give the measure. Then we also have something called parallel forms reliability. Sometimes you'll hear people call it alternate form reliability. This is when there's consistency between two forms of the same test. You may have seen this in your academic career, actually. If you've ever had a professor who gave more than one form of the same test, sometimes professors actually develop different forms that have different questions on them, but over the same content. And then sometimes you'll see professors that will have two different forms, but they'll just mix up the questions of the test. So parallel forms reliability or alternate form, what they do is they give these two forms of the same test, and then they'll do a correlation between the two and see how consistent they are among the two forms of the test. Another type of reliability that we already read about within our reading for this week is the internal consistency reliability. And what this is testing to see if there's consistency of items within the same test. Typically, this is going to be super easy to do. You'll have all of the data into SPSS, and then when you're running your data, you can actually click to run a Chromevox Alpha for your particular measure. It'll give you a lot of information. One, it'll give you what they call is your Chromevox Alpha, which is, it just tells you how related all the items are to one another, but it'll also give you a table that says if you delete one of the items, how that changes the Chromevox Alpha of your measure. Our reading also had some additional things that you could do if you weren't using a traditional kind of inventory or tool that most of us are going to use in this class. But there's still a few of you that actually have studies where you may need to learn to use R and learn to do the internal consistency reliability because you have some sort of computer software that you're using that doesn't give items in the same order, or if you do well on it, it alters the difficulty of the item. So although typically for most people that the internal consistency reliability is not going to be really hard to calculate, if you have some other type of measure that's a little bit more complicated, then you might have to use some dramatically more difficult types of way to calculate that analysis. There's also inter-rater reliability. We talked about this a little bit already, but we can go ahead and review it again because what I want you to do is be able to memorize each of these different types of reliability and tell me what they are, or if you read about it in an article, you should be able to pull out and tell me what type of reliability they used. So with inter-rater reliability, this is when we have consistency between or among raters. So the example when we talked about earlier was if you have people that are observing other people's behavior, that if you have more than one rater, that before they're able to go out, they'll go through a training and they will keep training until they can match about 85% consistency with other raters. So that would be, if we're going to put that in proportion form, that's 0.85, which should sound a little bit familiar, right? Because we saw that as kind of the standard that we see with internal consistency reliability. When we have internal consistency, we want our Cronbach's alpha to be about 0.85 or higher. That's not set in stone. That's just kind of a guideline that people try to follow. But it's not like a set in stone benchmark for people to use. So this brings us to validity. If you remember, validity basically is just saying that the measure is doing its job, or it's doing what it's supposed to. So there are several different types of validity, one of which is construct validity. And this is saying that the test measures some sort of underlying psychological construct. We have a little example that's a little bit later in this lecture where we'll go over an example of construct validity and how to establish it within a measure. We also have something called content validity. Content validity is where you have a test where the items sample the universe of items for which it was designed. So an example I like to use for this is the comprehensive exam. Okay, so if you have a teacher who says, hey, I'm going to give you a comprehensive final exam, what do you expect to be on that test? If you say that you expect to have questions from the content throughout the semester, you're right. So sometimes, and this can be some people's experience, where they have a professor that'll say, hey, we're going to have a comprehensive exam. And then when you come to the exam, even though you had like 15 different units, the professor decided to just test questions from chapter 3. Now that's really frustrating for the student because they spent all the time studying all 15 chapters when the test didn't actually reflect everything that it could. So a final exam that shows good content validity would have questions from each of those 15 different units. It may not be able to cover everything that was in each individual unit, but it takes it samples each of them so that it can kind of test the universe of, or all of the knowledge that they should know when they're coming out of the class. We also have a different type of validity called criterion validity, and this is when a test reflects some set of abilities. This can be in the present, or this could also be in the future. So when we speak about criterion validity, there's actually two different types of this. The first one that we're going to talk about is concurrent criterion validity. And this type of test reflects some sort of abilities in the present. So for this, an example would be an achievement test. So achievement tests are used in schools to see if a student is learning the curriculum the way that they should. This is separate from an IQ test, because IQ tests just test how well your brain functions essentially. So with achievement tests, if I was going to demonstrate that a student was doing learning well in the curriculum, and if my achievement test has a high concurrent criterion validity, that means there would be some sort of relationship between how they do on this achievement test and then also how well the student is doing in the classroom. Another example of this would be if you had to take an engineering exam to become licensed. Doing well on this engineering exam then should be related to you having really high quality skills as an engineer. It's predicting your set of abilities right now in the present. And this is a huge money making area within measurement because people use it for different certifications or become some sort of licensed professional. And so you see concurrent criterion validity used all of the time. The second type of criterion validity is where you have some sort of test that can predict someone's ability in the future. So if you're thinking about this, there are two really big examples if you had to take these tests that might be popping out in your brain right now. So for example, you may have had to take some sort of entrance exam, whether it was to get into undergraduate or even to our graduate program, such as the SAT, the GRE, the ACT, one of these types of tests. And so the reasons why they do this is those tests actually predict who will, people want to say that they actually predict who do well in grad school. That's actually not true, but what it does predict are those who will not do well their first year in college. And so that predicts, usually we want to say some sort of ability. In this case, the ACT and SAT actually predict failure. And so if you have a really, really low ACT, it's not likely that you'll actually do well in school, which is kind of unfortunate to hear, right? We also have something called face validity. A lot of people will say this is actually not a form of validity, and other people will argue that it is. But when we do face validity, this means the test appears at a glance to measure the construct of interest. So one way that you would do this is if you just looked at a test and you read through it, and you kind of look at a question and think, hey, I don't know if this question actually is measuring what it's supposed to. And then you kind of think about revising it a little bit. But just because you determine that something doesn't have face validity doesn't mean that you can't run other analyses to check other things. So for example, I once used a suicide questionnaire of some sort. It was a 4-item questionnaire. The questions were something like, my friends and family would be better off if I were dead. I have thoughts about killing myself. The third question is, I think about death and dying. And then there was another question that dealt directly with suicide. I think it was, I think I would kill myself if I knew a way. And so one of those 4 items don't really appear like they fit with the other items, right? So when I was using this measure, I looked at it, I'm like, I'm not sure that the third question that says, I think about death and dying, actually relate to suicide ideation or suicidal thoughts, which is the construct I was trying to tap. And so what my research lab did is we ran a Chromevox Alpha, and when we got those results, we noticed that if we took out that item, that the internal consistency reliability of our measure actually increased. And so if this happens, it doesn't always happen. If you have some sort of questionnaire and you're like, I'm not sure that this item fits with the other ones based off of your professional knowledge, this is when you're really deep into some sort of research area, then what you would do is make sure that you're running statistical analyses. And if you alter your measure in any way, you're going to want to make sure that you report that in your measure section of your method section of your paper, and make sure that you provide the data behind it, including other things like if you reran the Chromevox Alpha for it. And you got to make sure that you're making these decisions prior to running analyses, right? We want to make sure that we have all these decisions prior to actually testing your research question, because if you don't, you run into a little bit of an ethical problem there. We also have something called convergent validity, and this is how close the test is related to a similar measure. This is something I'm doing right now. I'm trying to develop a measure to use in some of my suicide research, and it's for items that have never been tested before. So what we're doing for this study is we have these items. So for example, one of the things that we're looking about is substance abuse, increased substance abuse. And so what we're doing is giving our participants a substance abuse measure that's already been validated. It has great psychometrics. It has really strong validity and reliability. So we'll give them that. We'll also give our brief measures with just 3 or so items. And then what we'll do is see a correlation between that measure and our measure to see how closely related it is. And you may be thinking right now, well, if there's already other substance abuse measures, why would you create your own when it's its own study and you have to go through this whole process? Unfortunately, although there are measures that are similar to the ones that we're wanting to use, they're not worded in the exact same way. And so what we're doing with this study is trying to get our measures developed now and have a large sample size if at all possible. And then we'll write an article on the reliability and validity of this measure, and then we'll use the same measure if it shows that we have high psychometric properties, and then we'll use that in our future research, which allows us to use it without having to get permissions to use these measures. I can use them forever, once I get them established with reliability and validity, which is really important because sometimes measures cost money to use. Pearson's notorious for having really high prices for some of the measures that they hold. And we actually, in order to do the study that we're doing, have had to contact quite a few different authors of some of these measures to get their permission to use their measures in our study. If this happens in your personal project that you're doing here, talk to me about it. I can send you kind of the example, that email that I use to send out to people indicating that my research is non-commercial, which means I'm not making any money for it, and that it's not a clinical trial. I don't have grant funding for it. I'm not doing anything where I'm going to publish their measures either. I'm just going to use it to make sure that my measures are high quality. For the most part, people have been really good. Even people who didn't quite understand the permission I was asking for eventually gave me permission to use their research. If your research is really important, some people will be really excited that you're using their measure for your research, especially if it's an area where you can make significant world change in a positive manner. And then on the flip side, we also have something called discriminant validity. And this is where you want to see that there's an inverse correlation between your test and some sort of unrelated test. We know that if you have a depression measure, that it should be inversely correlated with a happiness measure, right? That makes sense. So if you have some sort of happiness measure, you would think that there would be an indirect or an inverse correlation. Another way you can say that is a negative correlation between your happiness measure and your depression measure. So this is going to bring us to error. I know in one of our previous readings, they were saying that one of the assumptions for some regression is that there's no error in your measurement. And so that's something I kind of wanted to revisit because we didn't get a lot of time in class to talk about it. So something to know that whenever you're measuring anything, no matter how reliable and valid your measures are, they will never be perfect. One of the quotes from our reading from the random error versus systematic error reading that I really like was, it actually almost started the same way, which is funny because I actually made the slide before I knew I was going to make you guys have this reading. But what they said was, no matter how careful you are, there is always error in a measurement. Error is not a mistake. It's a part of the measuring process. So that's something really important to keep in mind. Yes, we want our measures to be reliable. Yes, we want them to be valid, but no matter what we do, we're going to have error. We're going to have error that we can control. We have error that we can't control. And one of those places that we get error from is measurement. We talked about other places that we get error from. Previously, we talked about random error, about how the temperature of your room, how the way that you phrase your directions, the way that you recruit, all these things contribute to error. And so that actually gives us rationale why we even have statistics in the first place. So I showed you this earlier in the semester, this observed score equals true score plus error. You now know from your readings for this week that this classic test theory equation actually is the observed score variance equals the true score variance plus the error variance, right? But they're saying the same thing. No matter what you measure, there's always going to be some element of error in your score. So for example, if I gave you all a test and one person scored a 99 on that test and someone else scored a 98 on the same test, you actually cannot say the person who scored the 99 did better than the person who scored a 98%. The reason for that is that there's some element of error. The person who got the 99%, maybe they guessed on half of their test and they were a really good guesser, whereas the person who did who scored the 98%, maybe they actually knew all of their answers that they got right. So we don't know what elements. There could be something else. Maybe the person who scored the 98% took their exam drunk, right? That would impair how they would do and may not truly reflect the knowledge that they know. Okay, so this also brings us back to levels of measurement. This is really important because if you're wanting to use a parametric analysis, you really have to pay attention to the levels of measurement. And this is something that sometimes students mess up, so I just want to draw attention to it one more time because it is something that you have to pay attention to when you're selecting which measures that you're going to use for your study. There's also the Likert scale debate. Y'all have probably heard different people's opinions on, is Likert scale data ordinal or can it count as a scale? And most people actually try to say that it's scale. I lean in the camp that I think it's actually ordinal data, but do recognize that people are using it in that way. When we have a Likert scale, it's hard to say that when you have a scale from 1 to 7, that there's equal distance between the 1 and the 2 as there is the 2 to 3. So when that happens, that means that that measurement's ordinal. Just because I'm saying that Likert scales are ordinal does not mean you can't use Likert scales in your studies. This is just something to think about again, just like all of the other information that I've been giving you along the way that you have to kind of pay attention to while you're designing your study. So remember that for most of the statistical analyses that you're going to use, the dependent variable must be on a scale, and this is why I'm kind of bringing it up now, because if you can get away with doing having some sort of measure that is not on a Likert scale, that's actually going to be better for your study. So for example, if I was interested in studying depression, a lot of times depression measures are on a Likert scale where you rate your symptoms from 1 to 7. Another way that possibly people could do that would be actually having people count how many days in the past week have they had these symptoms, or how many days in the past month have they had severe depression. Or another way could be for people to show you how many of the symptoms they have and mark them, and then you can literally count the number of symptoms that a person shows of depression. There are some issues with that too. If you use that method, then you might sacrifice some of the sensitivity of your measure. And so it's really important to weigh these options. And we're actually going to have an assignment that's due in a couple weeks where we do measure worksheets for multiple measures so that we can compare our measures in class and see which ones make the most sense to use in your study, because it's one of the most important things that you're going to be doing. Okay, so let's go over my dissertation for a little bit. In my dissertation, actually my dissertation and my thesis, I developed a measure called the CEOSP. And so the name of my dissertation was Measuring the Perceived Self-Efficacy of Teachers' Comprehensive Response to Youth Suicide. So in this, basically, what I was doing was developing a measure to see how confident teachers thought they could respond to suicide and engage in suicide prevention, suicide intervention, and then suicide postvention. If you remember, suicide postvention are the interventions that you do after someone dies by suicide to prevent other people dying from suicide. So in this process, I had to establish construct validity. So if you remember from before, what was construct validity? I'm going to give you a couple seconds to say it out loud. If you remember from earlier in this presentation, construct validity basically is that your measure is tapping some sort of underlying psychological construct. So in this case, my study was trying to examine self-efficacy, or people's confidence in their ability to do a specific task. True story, I don't know how much you all know about developmental psychology, but there is a famous psychologist and who did something called the Bobo doll experiment, and his name's Alfred Bandura, and I actually tried to contact him to be one of the experts on my dissertation. I did not hear back from him, but that's okay. I did try, right? And so what I did to establish this is I contacted different people that were self-efficacy experts, and then I had them examine my measures and make sure that my measure was actually tapping self-efficacy and not some other type of psychological construct. So if you look, this was some of the feedback that I got. And so one of the things that the experts told me, you can see that my original item here was that I can refer a student experiencing severe suicidal thoughts to the appropriate professional in my school. The experts indicated that I should remove can from the item and that I should make some sort of word stem that allowed the participants just to look at the item and know that it's self-efficacy. So the revised item then became refer a student experiencing suicidal thoughts to the appropriate professional in your school. So they kind of had me change some of the stems where instead of saying my, I said your. And the same thing happened with the second item, and I did this for all of the items on my measure. And so when I did the self-efficacy construct, when I was looking at that, I actually had the professionals for self-efficacy do this first, and then I contacted my suicide experts after I established the construct validity of this measure. So then, like I mentioned, I had to contact self-efficacy experts, but then I also had to contact suicide experts. And so the reason why I needed to contact the suicide experts was so that I could get some more information about the content validity of the measure. You'll see some of my words got cut off in the presentation. This was just kind of showing you a little excerpt of what my dissertation looked like. If you are curious about what was in my dissertation or you want to look it up, you can just take the name from my dissertation that's in this this presentation, and you can actually look it up in the JCKL website. You can actually look it up, but you have access to it. And it might not be a bad idea to ask your chair, hey, whoever your chair is for your thesis, hey, can I look up your thesis, see what you did? Or if you want to look up dissertations, things like that, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you can see how they are then. And if you also want, I know how much you guys love to read 100-page dissertations on measurement. I'm joking here. You can't see my face, but I'm joking. But if you really did want to get an in-depth look at what the measurement process looks like, you could definitely look into reading the dissertation as well. So I contacted about 14 national suicide prevention experts. I got 5 of them to come back and look at some of the items that I had and give me some feedback on it. And so during this process, what I did was I had each of the suicide experts rate each of my individual items as 1, not relevant, 2, somewhat relevant, 3, quite relevant, and 4, highly relevant. And then what I did was I took that data and I turned it into binary data. Actually, what I did was I turned ratings of a 3, which is quite relevant, or 4, highly relevant, and I gave it a rating of 1. And then the ratings of 1, not relevant, or 2, somewhat relevant, I gave them a new rating of 0. And then what I did was I added all the ratings from each of the experts together and divided by the number of experts to calculate something called the individual content validity index. And so if I had an item that had individual content validity index less than 1.0, then I kind of looked at each of the items and determined how to revise them and what I needed to do to make them better. In addition to the quantitative information that I collected from these experts, I also asked them to provide additional recommendations for changes to the items that they rated not relevant or somewhat relevant, just so I could see kind of what some of the issues were with the items that I created. So this is what the individual items looked like when I sent them out to my content experts for suicide. And so I gave them the items, and then they had to rate whether the item was not relevant, somewhat relevant, quite relevant, or highly relevant. If they marked it not relevant or somewhat relevant, Then they put suggestions for improvement under each of the items that I used to make decisions about the individual items and how I would rework them so that they were higher quality than what they were when I first started. So for example, if you look here, this is one of the tables from my dissertation. Item 1 had ICVI of 0.8, and so I don't remember exactly what the item included, but if you see here, it was something probably about referring students with severe suicidal thoughts. And so what one of the experts was saying here, because with a 0.8, that meant one of my experts didn't think that it was great. They said that, okay, so they may not know what a severe suicidal thought is, right? That doesn't have a great definition anyway. And now that I'm further along in my suicide research, I know that's actually true, right? What does severe suicidal mean? Does it mean persistent? Does it mean they also have suicide intent? And so that item was not a great item. For item 2, I had a 0.6. And so one of the people say that reverse coding can cause issues, which is true. We know that from test theory that we have some issues sometimes if we use reverse coding. Sometimes they're really important though. So I think I actually ended up following their advice and I made it not reverse coded. Sometimes you do that so that you don't get some sort of response set or some sort of person who's just reading your measure and going through the items, but there's also issues if you do that. So also something that someone said is if you use a Likert scale there, that I might end up with someone saying strongly agree, no one saying strongly agree. So if that's the case, what kind of effect would that be that we talked about earlier? I'll give you some time to answer that out loud. So there's two different ones it could be. This could be some sort of floor effect where if most of my sample ends up clustering closer to strongly disagree, then they do the strongly agree or agree option. But it also could be kind of that introversion where people, even if they could, they don't want to put it there. This could also cause issues potentially with the sensitivity of my measure and being able to tell if there's subtle differences in people's beliefs and their ability to be able to do some of these tasks. Item 3, I had two of my experts agreed on this where I used the word postvention in the item. You'll notice every time that I use the word postvention in our class, even though I've defined it probably almost every single class period, that I always say that postvention are the interventions that we do to prevent future deaths after someone dies by suicide. The reason I do that is probably for this reason here. I know that most people don't know what that means. That's jargony stuff, and if my audience for this measure is teachers, then most teachers aren't going to know what postvention means. So when I went in and revised that item, I didn't say postvention, I changed it. Okay, so if you see here, they gave me quite a bit great feedback on content validity, and you'll also see here that when I developed this measure that I was making sure that I had agreement among the experts who do this in their daily job, and I used kind of a mixed method research design to establish this measure. So here you can see some of the content validity changes that I made. First item, I can refer a student experiencing severe suicidal thoughts to the appropriate professional in my school. And then when I changed it, it became refer a student experiencing suicidal thoughts to the appropriate professional in your school. So you'll see kind of the changes that I had made because of the self-efficacy experts that used to help me with the construct validity. But something else you see here is that I removed severe from the item because teachers are not trained to evaluate the severity of suicidal thoughts. That's not within the realm of what they're supposed to do. So you'll see in item 2, I did eliminate that reverse coding. Where in the first item I said, if I believe a student is engaging in suicidal behaviors, I am incapable of asking questions of the student to determine what steps to take next. So instead I changed that to ask questions of a student to determine what steps to take next. if you believe he or she is engaging in suicidal behaviors. So when you look at the new item, what I did was take away incapable, which is a negative word. People in general have a really hard time understanding negative numbers or negative wording. So this probably was a better option to change it into a positively phrased word. And then item 3, which we talked about in the last slide, I can effectively contribute to a post-mention plan in the event that a student dies by suicide in my school. And I changed that to effectively contribute to a post-suicide response plan in the event that a student dies by suicide in my school. So you'll see here, I did that for every single item on this very lengthy measure that I developed. Here you can kind of see the item distributions, percentages by each of the anchors that I had. So if you see some of the items, you can see how they spread across. To have sensitivity, you do want to see that you have respondents in each of the different columns and that you don't want a majority of the people to cluster in one specific area. So if you're looking at this, I may had some issues potentially with some, maybe some floor effects, some of the items, maybe ceiling effects, but I did have respondents in each, so it was actually, I thought, not really that bad of item distribution for each of the items that I had here. So internal consistency, I also tested that in the dissertation. And what I found was that I had a Chromevox alpha of 0.982. And so what that means is that all of the items appear to be tapping the same thing, right? It's being reliable. The items are consistent with one another and really, really highly consistent with one another. So much so that there might be problems because maybe I have some redundant items that maybe I could have taken out. So here's that table that I told you that you'll get if you have your Chromevox alpha. You'll see here that I have my table of items and then what my Chromevox alpha is if I removed it. The total Chromevox alpha was really, really high for all 46 of the items. So likely I would not remove any of them from the measure. I also assessed test-retest reliability. In order to do this, I had a really huge sample, and I think I may have had over, I could be lying to you, but I think I had over 400 teachers complete this survey, and then I had about 30 participants who agreed to take it again a second time. And then what I did was I correlated their first test with their second, and I found that I had a test-retest reliability of 0.85 for my measure overall, which is really high. That's really a good, strong correlation. I also wanted to see if I did multiple regression, that the teacher's professional development and experiences dealing with suicidal ideation would account for kind of their CIAS scores. And so what I found was the hours of professional development was positively related to the sum of the CIAS scores and was statistically significant. And also so was their experiences with suicidal students. And I think that's really important because I was establishing criterion validity with this part of the analysis. Okay, so in the next couple of weeks, actually I think 2 weeks from now, I'm going to have you complete the measure worksheet for your potential measures that you're going to use in your study. So if you are doing some sort of ANOVA, ANCOVA, MANOVA, for each dependent variable that you have, you will need to complete this measure worksheet 3 times. If you are doing some sort of correlation, for each variable that you're looking at, you need to at least have the measurement worksheet in your measure for do 2 different measures for each of those variables if you have 2 variables. If you have 3 variables, then you would need 2 measures for each of those, so that would be a total of 6. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask me, but you need to make sure that you have it filled out, which means you have to have access to the full measure. That means all of the items. You also have to have the reliability and validity information, and you actually have to find the citations for that, or the references for that. You may have to put some of these requests into ILL, so you want to make sure that you're doing this way in advance rather than waiting till the week it's due. So I would get started on this week, even though it's not going to be due for a couple of weeks. And this will kind of help you because your assignment that's going to be due for your manuscript next week will be basically a mini research proposal where I'm going to ask you to give me your research question, your research and null hypotheses, and things like that. So make sure that you're using this, because if you're not finding multiple measures that you could potentially use for your study, then that might change what you're going to put into your proposal. All right, so if we were going to have class today, we actually would have tried to create a measure, and this might be something that we do in next week's class because it's really hard. So we're going to have to come up with some sort of construct, so be thinking about that this week. Think about what kind of measure you want to make, and then we're going to try to do this in class because it's really hard. So for your homework assignment for next week, what I need you to do is read chapter 13 in our CASDEN. So in our folder, there's a link that you'll click that will take you directly to it, and then complete the quiz like you've been doing. And then for our project for our prospectus paperwork, I want you to complete the measure worksheet for 3 measures that measure the same dependent variable. We've been talking about this for a few weeks now. Many of you already have 1, maybe even 2 measures for this, so you'll need to do all 3, and then you'll need to fill in the information on the measure worksheet, which is in our folder for this week, for each individual measure. So for this, I'll be asking for information about the psychometric information that you learned about from the readings from this PowerPoint that I have for you. And then you also need to have copies of each measure. So next week what we'll do is we'll share as a class again, like we did in the last class period before spring break. And we'll go through and decide try to work together as a class to figure out what measures you all will use for each of your projects. And so, for example, some of y'all said that you're going to have to use an existing measure and adapt it. So make sure if that's your project that you go back and review from the CASDEN reading. I think it was the first reading for this week where they talk about what you need to do if you adapt an existing measure, and the types of information that will need to go into your own studies results section regarding whatever you've done to the measure and some of its psychometric information from your personal study. So you will also need to make sure that you have copies of each measure. So that means I need to see the actual questions that belong to each measure because we will be using that in class to make some informed decisions. So that's what we have for next week. This week, make sure that you go in and evaluate all the work that you did for today. Today, what was due was the 2 readings on measurement and then your power analysis. And so next week, if we have enough time, we can go through each of the power analyses to make sure that everything's correct. If you have changed anything with your research question and hypotheses, please send me an email and we can try to find a time to meet during my virtual office hours so that we can keep chugging along. All right, well, I hope you all have a great evening, and I'll see you soon.